What if your childhood wasn't about games, but about blood, blisters, and bone-deep pain? What if your job meant bending your body into a weapon and risking death for pennies a day? In the brutal world of medieval warfare, archers weren't just soldiers, they were tools, used hard, discarded fast. No armor, no glory. Just a longbow, a pack of arrows, and a body that hurt more with every shot. This isn't fantasy, this was real life. So here's the question. Could you survive the brutal life of a medieval archer? Number 1, chosen by law, not by will. Being a medieval archer wasn't about passion or ambition. It was about obedience. No child ever said, "When I grow up, I want to be an archer." That wasn't how things worked. In England, the decision was made for you, by your king, by your society, and by the relentless demands of war. If you were a boy and your body worked, that was enough. From the moment you could walk straight, you were expected to start preparing for a role that would shape and possibly destroy your life. The training wasn't optional, it was law. And this wasn't some ceremonial guideline tucked away in old scrolls. It was enforced publicly and harshly. Every able-bodied male between the ages of 7 and 60 had to practice longbow shooting every single Sunday after church. This wasn't a drill, this wasn't for fun. And if you missed training, you faced penalties, a fine or worse, humiliation in front of your entire community. Imagine being 10 years old, already burdened with a massive bow that towered over you. Now imagine being told to pull it over and over again, not for minutes, but for hours, until your hands blistered, your arms trembled, and your back screamed in pain. But the pain didn't matter. No one cared if you cried. No one would tell you to take a break or ask if you were okay. Because in the eyes of your village, your family, and your future military commander, pain was progress. If you weren't bleeding or shaking, you weren't trying hard enough. You were expected to grow into that bow. You were expected to become stronger, faster, and more resilient. Because if you couldn't draw a bow in wartime, you were nothing. This wasn't about learning a skill. It was about becoming a tool, a living, breathing weapon in the hands of the crown. Your worth as a man, even before manhood, was defined by your ability to obey, to endure, and to shoot. While other children in different eras might have been praised for curiosity or imagination, a medieval archer was praised for grit, for silence, for toughness. So no, being a medieval archer wasn't something you dreamed about. It was something you survived. The job didn't ask who you were, it told you what to become. And if you couldn't keep up, there was always someone younger, stronger, and more desperate ready to take your place. Number 2, childhood built in pain. In the medieval world, childhood was not a time of innocence for those destined to be archers. It was a time of transformation, and not in a poetic coming-of-age sense. No, this was physical, brutal, and relentless. Boys as young as 7 were handed bows, not toys, but serious training tools, and told to start practicing. The first few years were spent with smaller, lighter bows just to get used to the motion. But by the age of 12 or 13, there was no more easing into it. You were handed the real thing, a longbow that required strength most adults today wouldn't manage without serious gym time. The training wasn't about hitting the bullseye. It wasn't even about aiming at all. It was about building the kind of upper body strength that could keep you alive in war. These kids didn't shoot at targets for fun. They pulled heavy strings over and over until their muscles burned and their hands split open. No one stopped them. No one told them to rest. The philosophy was simple. If your body breaks now, it won't break on the battlefield. Crying didn't help. Complaining got you nothing. The only answer was to draw the bow again and again. Daily routines looked more like ancient military workouts than anything a child should go through. You'd carry stones to build shoulder and back strength. You'd haul buckets of water with outstretched arms. You'd pull back a bowstring hundreds of times a day, feeling your fingers thicken and your shoulders warp under the stress. The movement became so repetitive, so ingrained, that it rewired the body. Quite literally. Archaeological digs have uncovered skeletons that tell this story better than any book. Longbowmen had visibly thicker left arms from years of holding and drawing. Their spines were often twisted, especially the upper vertebrae, from standing and shooting in the same posture for hours on end. Their fingers were covered in bony ridges, evidence of the constant friction and pressure from the bowstring. These weren't just warriors. They were shaped by their tools. The body became the bow's companion, molded to fit its demands. By the time a young archer reached 16, he was expected to perform like a war machine. 12 arrows per minute. Precision at 200 yards, roughly 2 football fields away. Not bad for someone who'd been lifting rocks and bleeding through his training since childhood. Their fingers weren't just calloused, they were hardened like leather. The grooves from the string were permanent, deep as scars. And maybe that was a blessing in disguise, because if you got hurt, medieval medicine wouldn't do much. If anything went wrong, the best advice was often, put some mud on it and keep moving. Number 3, mastering the beast. You might imagine that after years of training, after bleeding hands and burning shoulders, a medieval archer would feel a deep bond with his weapon. But the relationship between a man and his longbow was far more complicated than admiration or even respect. The English longbow was an engineering marvel, yes, but it was also an unrelenting source of physical suffering. It wasn't a tool you picked up, it was a burden you carried in every sense of the word. The bow itself was usually around 6 feet tall, sometimes taller, roughly the same height as the archer using it. It was typically crafted from yew, a wood prized for its elasticity and strength. A well-made bow weighed around 3 to 5 kilograms, which might not sound like much until you've had to carry it for hours while marching through mud, rain, or snow. Unlike swords or axes that were holstered or sheathed, a longbow had to be carried in hand or slung awkwardly over the shoulder, making every step feel just a little heavier. But that wasn't the worst part. The true punishment came from the draw weight, the amount of force needed to pull the string back to firing position. Surviving examples of medieval longbows revealed draw weights of anywhere from 90 to 180 pounds. That's 2 to 3 times the strength required to draw a modern hunting bow. To put it into perspective, that's the equivalent of lifting a medium-sized dog, using only 3 fingers and then doing it again and again. Hundreds of times, every day. There was no technique to cheat the physics. No special glove, no clever grip, no graceful trick. It was pure grinding muscle. Archers had to develop not just brute strength, but a kind of focused, explosive power in their backs, shoulders, and arms. The longbow didn't allow for hesitation. If you lacked the strength, the bow simply didn't bend. If you were tired, your arrows didn't fly. You were either ready or useless, and the body paid for it. Over time, the physical cost of using the longbow was burned into an archer's bones. Archaeological finds show skeletons of longbowmen with thickened left arms, where the bow was held steady, and twisted spines from years of drawing on one side. Their right shoulders were often hunched and overdeveloped. Joints became inflamed and swollen. Fingers showed signs of constant friction, and many had developed bone growths, literal lumps of stress calcification around the wrist and knuckles. Some had permanent grooves worn into their fingertips from the bowstring. Many suffered from chronic arthritis by their 20s. Some lived with crushed or compressed vertebrae. The longbow reshaped their bodies the way the ocean reshapes stone, slowly but permanently. And still, they shot. Every day. Whether in training or on the battlefield, pain was simply part of the routine. There was no celebration of resilience, no cheering crowd, just another arrow, another pull, another day surviving a weapon that punished its master as much as it punished the enemy. Number 4, maintenance under fire. Keeping a longbow ready for battle was more than just sharpening arrows. It was a constant, almost obsessive process of maintenance that could mean the difference between life and death. The bowstrings alone were a full-time job. Usually made from hemp or flax, they were tough, but very vulnerable to moisture. If they got wet, they'd stretch, lose tension, or even snap completely. So archers had to keep them waxed at all times. Every evening, every break, every moment not spent shooting was used to inspect and condition the string. Most archers didn't carry just one string. They had at least 3 spares with them at all times, each one carefully wrapped in waxed cloth to stay dry. And where did they keep them? Anywhere they could. Some hid them under their helmets, some in leather pouches, some even, so the stories go, in less respectable places. That might sound odd, but when your survival hinges on having a dry, intact string, modesty becomes meaningless. The bow itself was just as fragile, made typically from yew wood, which had just the right balance of stiffness and flexibility. The longbow could warp if stored improperly. Heat, humidity, or even being left leaning the wrong way could ruin it. A warped bow wouldn't shoot straight. A cracked bow was worthless. And in war, there was no chance of running to the nearest shop for a new one. Even the best-made bows had a limited lifespan. After intense use, they simply broke down. That's why many archers carried tools and raw materials to make emergency repairs, or even whole spare bows if they had the strength to carry them. Then there were the arrows. They weren't mass-produced and definitely not universal. An arrow had to be carefully matched to the specific draw weight of the archer's bow and the intended purpose. If an arrow was too light, it would fly erratically. If it was too heavy, it would drop short of the target. You needed just the right balance. War arrows were often thick, heavy, and tipped with bodkin points meant to punch through armor, while lighter arrows might be used for hunting or signaling. A good archer could feel the difference instantly. Adjusting for wind, distance, elevation, it wasn't some high-concept tactic. It was instinct, developed from daily repetition. That's why daily training wasn't just encouraged. It was mandatory. Skipping even one day could mean falling behind. Punishments for missing practice ranged from fines to public humiliation. Discipline wasn't flexible. And after all that effort, archers still had complicated feelings about their weapon. Many nicknamed their bow "my wife" because it demanded so much and gave back so little. One archer, questioned for drinking too much, famously said, "My bow takes my life. At night, the ale is mine." That wasn't just bitterness, it was honesty from someone who gave everything to a weapon that never once said thank you. Number 5. The weight of war. Medieval warfare was a brutal test of strength, not only on the battlefield, but long before it. For archers, war meant dragging your life on your back, and the weight was staggering. The longbow itself measured nearly 2 meters and weighed around 5 kilograms. Doesn't sound like much? Try lugging that around after a 20-mile march, through mud, rain, and blistering heat. And that was just the beginning. Arrows were the real burden. Each war archer carried between 60 and 100 arrows, which could weigh as much as 12 kilograms altogether. Unlike the romanticized image you see in films, archers didn't wear sleek quivers across their backs. That would have been impractical and dangerous in real combat. Instead, arrows were stuffed wherever they could fit, tied to belts, jammed into boots, or stuck upright in the dirt around them for easy access during battle. It wasn't glamorous, it was survival. Running out of arrows wasn't just inconvenient, it was a death sentence. A bow without arrows was just a long stick. So archers prepared obsessively. They carried spare arrowheads, shafts, fletching feathers, even tiny kits to craft arrows on the go. It was like being part warrior, part carpenter. Making an arrow mid-fight wasn't ideal, but it beat facing armored cavalry with bare hands. Rain was one of their worst enemies. Water soaked everything, adding weight, reducing mobility, and worst of all, ruining bowstrings. Wet hemp or flax strings lost tension and could snap. To prevent this, archers carried multiple spare strings, each one wrapped in waxed cloth to keep moisture out. Where they stored them? Anywhere dry. Some hid them in pouches, some under helmets. There are even tales of archers hiding strings in their undergarments. not out of habit, but out of desperation. When your life depended on a dry string, dignity didn't matter. And that was just the combat gear. Archers also had to carry rations, dried meat, stale bread, maybe some dried beans if they were lucky. Water flasks added even more weight, along with fire-starting kits, spare boots, and their minimal armor. Most wore padded gambesons weighing 10 to 15 kilograms, and if they were fortunate, a chain shirt or helmet, tacking on another 20 kilos. In total, the average medieval archer marched with 60 to 80 kilograms strapped to or hanging from his body. That's nearly the weight of another person. And they weren't riding horses. They were on foot, day after day, through miserable terrain and unpredictable weather. The joke among them went, "I'm half man, half mule." But behind that humor was hard truth. An archer didn't just fight the enemy, he fought the ground, the weather, the weight, and the endless exhaustion that began long before the first arrow flew. Number 6. Armor for the poor. Archers were often the most lightly protected men on the battlefield, and that wasn't a strategic choice. It was poverty, plain and simple. While knights strutted around in full plate armor that cost a small fortune and glinted in the sunlight, archers wore what they could afford. Thick quilted jackets called gambesons. These padded coats weighed around 10 to 15 kilograms and looked more like overstuffed bedding than battle gear. They were better than nothing, good at absorbing slashes and stopping light blows, but they were hot, heavy, and soaked up rain like a sponge. Wearing one in summer was a slow roast. Wearing one in winter was like hauling a wet mattress. Some archers were lucky enough to scavenge or be issued chainmail, which offered better protection, but added another 20 kilograms to their already brutal load. A few even wore partial pieces of plate armor taken off fallen enemies, though this was rare. Helmets were a must when available. Yes, typically conical steel caps or bassinet styles, but they still added an extra 3 to 5 kilograms pressing down on your neck. Archers didn't usually carry large shields. If they had any, they were small, round, and strapped to the forearm, more symbolic than practical. As for weapons, archers had to be realists. Their first tool of defense? A simple knife, the kind you might use to cut rope or slice meat in camp. In desperate situations, it became a last resort weapon. Some carried hand axes, useful both in battle and for chopping wood. Others opted for short hammers or maces, better for crushing than slicing. These weren't fancy weapons, they were basic, brutal tools, chosen because they were cheap and effective. And then there was all the extra gear: rations, water flasks, cloaks for sleeping, fire-starting kits, spare strings, sometimes even arrow-making materials. A pair of backup boots wasn't uncommon either, especially when marching through endless mud and stone. By the time you strapped all that on, you were hauling 60 to 80 kilograms on your back, hips, shoulders, and sometimes even around your neck. No surprise archers joked, "I'm half man, half donkey." It wasn't an exaggeration, and if an archer told you he didn't have back pain, he was either already dead or just didn't want to admit it. Number 7. The march before the battle. Before even a single arrow could be loosed, medieval archers faced a different kind of battle: the brutal, soul-draining march to the battlefield. Forget horses or wagons. You were on your feet, often covering 20 to 30 miles a day, every single day, with 60 to 80 pounds of gear on your back. There was no caffeine to keep you sharp, no protein snacks in your pouch. If you were lucky, you got some stale bread and cold water in the morning. That was breakfast. Fires were often forbidden, especially on enemy territory, because smoke could give away your position. So meals were cold, and so was morale. Now picture your boots. Thin leather, no padding, no waterproofing, and definitely no arch support. When they wore out, and they always did, you either wrapped your feet in spare cloth, stitched together scraps of old gear, or just kept going barefoot. Some men soaked their feet in vinegar or salt to toughen the skin. Others walked barefoot over stones to form calluses faster. It wasn't a strategy, it was desperation. Weather could turn everything into hell. Summer heat meant dehydration, dizziness, and heat stroke. Winter brought numb toes, frostbitten fingers, and the constant ache of cold seeping into your bones. Rain was the worst. It soaked every layer of clothing, made the already heavy gear even heavier, turned paths into slippery pits of mud, and worst of all, it ruined bowstrings. A soaked string meant a useless bow, which meant you were just a guy carrying a long stick into battle. Some commanders would actually delay the march just to avoid deep mud or flooded trails, because they knew losing half the army in a swamp wasn't great strategy. Still, delays meant fewer supplies and longer exposure to disease and exhaustion. Sleeping arrangements? There weren't any. Tents were for nobility. Archers slept on the ground, wrapped in their cloaks, pressed close to each other for warmth, praying bugs or rats didn't crawl across their faces in the night. Every step forward was paid in pain. Blisters turned to open wounds. Muscles ached. And through it all, there was no turning back. You walked because that was your job. You walked because a king ordered you to. You walked because stopping wasn't survival. The march broke many men before the enemy ever got a chance to try. Number 8, the arrow wall. Medieval archers weren't just skilled marksmen. They were the living artillery of their time. But unlike modern artillery that relies on machines, these men became the machines. On the battlefield, they weren't randomly scattered. They were arranged in curved lines, not straight rows. That slight arc wasn't for looks. It allowed them to fire at a single target from multiple angles, creating a brutal crossfire zone where escape was almost impossible. If you were caught in that zone, you didn't just get hit. You got pinned to the earth like a sheet of parchment on a board. These formations weren't guesswork. They were calculated. Every variable mattered. Wind speed, terrain elevation, sun position. A small hill? That was range and visibility. A forest at your back? Protection from cavalry. Archers studied their surroundings like battlefield mathematicians. They adjusted their spacing, shifted position, and changed angles on command. Theirs wasn't mindless shooting. It was synchronized chaos engineered for destruction. A well-trained longbowman could shoot 10 to 12 arrows per minute. One man, now imagine 100. That's over 1,000 arrows falling every minute like iron rain. At Agincourt, 6,000 English archers fired 60,000 arrows per minute. 60,000. Think about that. Every tick of the second hand, another 1,000 deadly missiles cutting through the air. It wasn't just combat, it was weather. Arrows fell so thick soldiers said it blocked the sun. Some battles were lost before a sword was drawn, simply from the sheer psychological impact of that kind of assault. Infantry formations disintegrated under that kind of pressure, but cavalry suffered even more. Horses became the first targets. Archers would plant sharpened wooden stakes in the ground, angled to impale charging mounts. Then they aimed low. A dead horse meant a downed knight, and a downed knight was an easy kill. The archers knew where to aim too. Their arrows weren't random. The warheads could punch through 10 centimeters of solid oak. Chainmail was useless, it barely slowed the shot. Even full-plate armor wasn't safe. Every suit of armor had weak points, under the arms, in the visor, between the plates. That's where they aimed. And they didn't miss often. It wasn't elegance, it was efficiency. Death, calculated by angle and repetition. That's what the arrow wall really was. A medieval meat grinder powered by years of brutal training and bodies conditioned for one task, bringing down the enemy before he even got close. Number 9, close and personal. Once the last arrow had flown, the entire role of a medieval archer flipped in an instant. From the controlled rhythm of long-range combat, where skill, calculation, and coordination ruled the battlefield, things suddenly turned raw and chaotic. There were no backups, no reserve forces waiting to jump in, no chance to fall back and regroup. If the enemy reached your line and your quiver was empty, You either fought hand to hand or died where you stood. And let's be real, archers weren't trained for this. Their standard secondary weapon? A small utility knife. Something you'd use to cut bread or trim rope. Against a charging knight in full plate armor, it was as threatening as a twig. Yet that's what many had to rely on. Some had heavier options. Wooden clubs reinforced with metal bands or spikes, improvised warhammers, even axes stolen or scavenged along the way. A few desperate archers tried modifying their own bows, adding sharpened ends to swing them like staffs. But a 6-foot stick isn't much comfort when your enemy has a longsword and years of brutal melee experience. Archers wore little more than padded jackets called gambesons. These were fine for deflecting the cold, but not steel. Knights, in contrast, were walking fortresses, encased in iron, trained since childhood to kill with precision and strength. They carried blades custom-made by elite blacksmiths, and they knew how to use them. The imbalance was ridiculous. Archers weren't even supposed to survive that kind of fight, and yet they sometimes did. That's what makes this moment so fascinating. With zero training in swordplay, minimal armor, and no hope of reinforcement, some archers still managed to fight back. Outnumbered, overpowered, and outclassed, they turned to desperation and grit. Some threw themselves at the enemy in blind fury. Others backed into tight terrain, used fallen bodies as barricades or targeted armor gaps. It was messy. It was savage. It was pure survival. One chronicler described it best: a mouse fighting a cat. But the mouse had already slaughtered the cat's entire family from a distance. That single line sums up the madness perfectly. Archers weren't supposed to win in melee, but after years of enduring physical torment, marching miles in pain, and shaping their lives around survival, they weren't the kind of men who gave up easily. Number 10, after the arrows. Surviving the battlefield didn't mean the suffering was over. It just meant you qualified for the next level of pain. Arrow wounds were everywhere, and they didn't always come from the enemy. With thousands of arrows flying at once, friendly fire was almost expected. Chaos blurred the lines between friend and foe, and when an arrow hit, the real horror began. Surgeons, if you were lucky enough to have one nearby, called these good wounds, because at least you could access both entry and exit points. But pulling the arrow out, that was medieval nightmare fuel. They had tools for it, sure. Things like iron pincers or beak-shaped tongs, designed to grab and twist embedded arrowheads. The catch? They only worked half the time. The other half? The arrow snapped, or the head stayed lodged in your flesh. When that happened, you had two options: live with it and hope for the best, or face amputation. And in those days, cutting off a limb was closer to rolling dice than performing medicine. There were no anesthetics, no sterile tools, no understanding of bacteria. Just a blade, a strong assistant, and a prayer. If the wound was from a sword or mace, things could be worse. Deep cuts ripped muscles and shattered bones. Flesh turned black. Gangrene crept in fast. Amputation was sometimes the only option, and even then, your odds of survival were low. First aid in the field meant wine poured straight into the wound. Not for drinking, though you might have wished it was, but to clean out debris and dirt. Then they'd stitch you up with whatever they had. Pig bristles, horsehair, unwashed and reused again and again. The risk of infection? Almost certain. To stop the bleeding, they burned the wound closed with hot irons. No painkillers, just something to bite down on and a crowd pretending they didn't hear your screams. Hospitals, if you could call them that, were piles of straw soaked in blood and sweat. Sanitation didn't exist. Doctors blamed everything but germs. Bad air, rotten blood, the phases of the moon. Some tried honey, surprisingly effective. Others rubbed in cow dung, not so much. Surviving a wound in medieval times wasn't just rare, it was a miracle. And if you did survive, chances were you'd never hold a bow again. Number 11, broke and broken. Surviving a medieval war as an archer didn't mean winning. In fact, the end of the battle often marked the start of an even tougher fight. Just to live. One missing finger was enough to end your career. You couldn't draw a longbow with damaged hands, and for many that meant the end of any chance at income. Some archers even maimed themselves on purpose, cutting fingers off to escape another conscription. Sounds extreme, but for them, it was a calculated move. Better to lose a finger than your life. And even for those still in one piece, the pay was abysmal. 6 pennies a day might sound like something, but that barely covered a modest meal and maybe a bit of ale. If the payment came at all. Delays were common. Sometimes the king's treasury ran dry and archers were told to wait. Wait where? Wait how? They had mouths to feed, so they found their own solutions. Looting was technically illegal, but no one really stopped it. Everyone looked the other way. If you brought down a knight, you didn't just eliminate a threat, you hit a jackpot. That armor alone could be worth an entire year's wages. Even the knight's boots or horse had value. And if you were fast and ruthless enough on the battlefield, you might leave with more wealth than months of marching could earn. But that brief gain was rarely enough. In times of peace, archers were forgotten. There were no pensions, no long-term care, no hero's welcome. Most turned to seasonal labor, farming when needed, building when possible, hunting or working with wood. A few joined festivals or archery tournaments, showing off their skills for small prizes and public amusement. Injury compensation? At best, a few coins. A small handful of loyal archers got land grants, but that was rare and usually reserved for favorites. If you were injured, you paid the doctor yourself, and since war injuries were often severe, medical costs could wipe out everything you'd earned. Retirement didn't exist for the average archer. The dream of saving enough to buy land or start a trade? Unrealistic. Most died as they lived, poor, overworked, and broken. The hands that once held the power to change battles now struggled to hold a shovel. Even in death, many couldn't afford a proper burial. Their sacrifices might have built kingdoms, but their graves were often unmarked. Number 12. Unwanted heroes. In medieval society, longbowmen existed in a strange in-between. They weren't noble enough to earn respect from the top, but too valuable to be treated like common peasants. In war, they were unstoppable. Their arrows turned battles, brought down knights, and broke armies. But once the fighting ended, the glory vanished fast. Back home, they were just another mouth to feed, often wounded, poor, and haunted. They didn't belong at the Lord's table, but they were no longer welcome among the villagers either. They'd seen too much, done too much. People didn't know whether to thank them or fear them. The way they were portrayed in books and stories says it all. Nobles who wrote the tales mocked them as foul-mouthed and uncultured, but still admitted one scary truth. A peasant with a bow could kill a knight from 200 yards. One French aristocrat even said, "It's an unfair art that lets the low-born kill their betters without giving them a chance to fight." That wasn't just a complaint, it was genuine fear, dressed up as moral outrage. Villages and towns passed laws to keep returning archers in check. Drunken fights, brawls, theft, these weren't uncommon. You train a man to kill, then drop him back into civilian life with no help, no job, no plan. What do you think happens? The church didn't help much either. Priests preached that long-range weapons like the longbow were unholy, especially when used against fellow Christians. The contradiction was obvious. Kings praised these men as heroes, priests condemned them as sinners. Some archers tried to buy their way back into God's good graces with donations. Others just hoped their service counted for something up above. In the eyes of women, archers were double-edged. During wartime, they brought in decent coin and were seen as potential providers. But the risk was always there. Many never returned. Some returned broken. Widow numbers in archer-heavy areas were significantly higher. For children, archers were both role models and cautionary tales. Boys admired the heroism but were terrified of being chosen. Parents often hid strong sons when recruiters came knocking, hoping they'd be spared the path of war. Archers lived between battles and between classes. Feared, used, forgotten. They carried kingdoms on their backs, but rarely got a seat at the table.